We look at risers and fallers from the Baltimore Ravens 2024 OTAs, all that and more coming up next here on Locked On Ravens.
You are Locked On Ravens, your daily Baltimore Ravens podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into another edition of Locked On Ravens, your daily Baltimore Ravens podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Ostreicher, Ravenswire. We're here with you on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you so much for being here, making Locked On Ravens a part of your Monday today and your first listen each and every day. Our friend available on all podcasting platforms. So that means in video form on YouTube, we're here for you. You can like the video, subscribe to the channel. Also in audio form, wherever you get your favorite podcasts on your favorite podcast providers, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, the whole 9 yards there. You can follow along, subscribe as well. We're 5 days per week, plus bonus content of Ravens. So you get news, analysis, updates, the whole 9 yards. We go live after Ravens games and every piece of Ravens big news. So if you couldn't tell, we're very Ravens-centric over here on Locked On Ravens. Today's episode of Locked On Ravens is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. We are here on a Monday. Another week of Baltimore Ravens football. Mandatory minicamp starts up for the Ravens on Tuesday. So tomorrow through Thursday will be mandatory minicamp. OTAs officially over. That wrapped up last week. We're going to wrap up that conversation here today, talking about some risers and fallers for OTAs for the Ravens. Guys who impressed, guys who didn't. Now, good news, there are a lot more guys who impressed versus those who didn't. And again, what can you take away from OTAs? There's only a limited amount of information, as we've talked about here on this show. And as everybody talks about, really, the big takeaways come once the pads come on, training camp, preseason, and of course, once you get to the games. We're going to still talk about who impressed, who didn't. So in the first part of the show, we'll talk risers. Second part of the show, we'll talk fallers. And then final part of the show, we'll get into what to expect from mandatory minicamp for the Ravens, a little minicamp preview, which we'll get into a bit more on tomorrow's episode, which is when minicamp starts. So let's talk about some OTA risers for the Ravens. We'll go position by position for the Ravens and just dive into, in general, what guys impressed and what guys didn't. But, of course, we're just focusing on the positives for this segment. So, in my opinion, when you talk about the risers, I think for me, starting off at the wide receiver position is where I'm going to go. You know, we could talk about Lamar Jackson, but he really wasn't there for most of the time. Derrick Henry wasn't there for most of the time either. I want to start wide receiver-wise and talk about Nelson Agholor first of all. And again, on the field is one thing, but to me, I just think his stock rose and just everything, you know, just felt like Agholor gained a lot of positive momentum just from his comments about him becoming a better player during the course of OTAs. And while that's not necessarily quote unquote on the field, I want to keep driving home how cool it was. Some of Nelson Agholor's comments, particularly about Lamar Jackson, also had some great ones about the rookie cornerback. For those who didn't hear those, the spark notes of it, you know, really quick version is that he called Lamar Jackson cerebral, talked about how he and Lamar, you know, communicated, particularly Lamar, how he communicated. And then for the rookie corners, just trying to get them up to speed, having them feel welcome, and then beating them on the field, on the practice field, and having them get a mindset of, man, we can't let this old vet beat us or whatever. Something along those lines, he said. So Agholor is stepping up. And by the way, when you're talking about a riser and faller or just like stock up, stock down, winner, loser, that doesn't just include what happens on the field. It's about being a leader, you know, taking on different roles, both on and off the field. So I want to classify and clarify that my rankings here and my reports aren't just about what happens on the field, because a big part of this also is just, you know, about what happens off of it too. So Agholor, to me, when you want to talk about on the field, Tez Walker is a guy that impressed everybody on the field. Rookie wide receiver, fourth rounder out of North Carolina. Felt like he took an opportunity and then took another one and then took another one. And it just felt like he was always taking advantage of the opportunities that he was being given. And felt like he was always in the news, right? Whenever we heard everybody, okay, who performed well during OTAs? Tez Walker was the name that popped up. We'll talk about TJ Tampa a little bit later, but he was always in a battle, it felt like, with TJ Tampa. And, it's the Tez Walker versus TJ Tampa battle. Walker had a few touchdown catches, had a nice back shoulder catch during red zone drills. And by the way, shout out to everybody who was out there. You know, I'm pulling this from like multiple different sources. So, you know, everybody, Jonah Schaefer, Kyle Barber, you know, Ryan Mink, et cetera, everybody who was out there, but caught a back shoulder catch during red zone drills and Also, the fact that he's starting off well in camp bodes very well for Baltimore's wide receiver room, considering they're going to need guys to step up in that room throughout the entire course of the year. And speaking of a dark horse candidate for a roster spot, a lot of people were talking about him. They weren't talking about him. Now they're back talking about him. Malik Cunningham. Malik Cunningham is a guy who obviously the Ravens signed off of the Patriots practice squad back last season, but was a quarterback at that time, right? So made the switch full-time over to wide receiver. And for Cunningham, he started off his OTAs, his offseason workouts with an absolute bang. So to me, it's a good sign that Cunningham is able to, get these. And apparently he's, toe tapping catches, making full extension grabs, like every single part of his game that you want to see from a converted player. Like he's picking that up really quickly. And you can talk about Zay Flowers and Rashad Bateman giving him pointers, giving him tips. Flowers and Bateman, we talked about this on our bonus episode on Saturday. So if you didn't listen to our bonus episode, be sure to check that out in the bonus episode section on YouTube. Also, just, on the regular feed on the podcast and platform and audio form. But regardless, Cunningham's getting a lot of teaching right now from those guys. And it's a process, but sometimes with these converted players, it takes a really long time for them to pick things up. We're not hearing about stuff like this until the middle of training camp when it's finally clicked for a guy. But Cunningham starting off really, really well during Baltimore OTAs. Now, tight end wise, Charlie Kohler had an incredible play towards the end of OTAs and seems like he's a guy that's going to get more snaps this season. I think everybody's talking about Mark Andrews and Isaiah Likely and how are they going to use Isaiah Likely with Mark Andrews? That tandem has to do well, which, by the way, absolutely is true. But Kohler is a guy, I think if the Ravens can use their 3 tight end sets effectively, this offense is going to be so impactful in multiple different ways, more ways than we saw last season. The first step of that is making sure your 2 tight end sets are effective, making sure Isaiah Likely gets on the field. But Kohler is a player who I think is a two-way guy, both as a blocker and as a pass catcher, that if he evolves here in year 3, it could cause the Ravens to add multiple different elements to their offense, which I think is really, really good. You talk about now, offensive linemen, there were a few guys. I mean, I think it's great that Andrew Voorhees is back. He talked to the media towards the end of OTAs. He was feeling great and getting those reps in. I'm not necessarily going to call him a stock up guy. We will talk about a stock down guy on that offensive line coming in the second part of the show. But then you move over to the defensive side of the ball. And there have been a lot of different players who have impressed. Tavius Robinson, second-year guy, who is an outside linebacker, I think is going to pine for more playing time at this point. And honestly, I didn't expect him to get as much playing time as he did in year 1, but he was in there on early downs, wreaking havoc, setting the edge and doing his thing. So I think I would not be shocked if he starts a little higher up in the depth chart than some people might anticipate at this point. Inside linebacker-wise, we know Trenton Simpson has been dominating and has been playing really well. We knew that he did that in Pittsburgh or against Pittsburgh in week 18, but seems like he's really finding a groove, and hopefully that will pay off in the long run, especially because the Ravens will need him to step up in the absence of Patrick Queen. Now, when you're talking about the secondary, I feel like this is where we're getting most of the risers here in OTAs. I'd mentioned TJ Tampa. He was in that battle with Tez Walker. Not that Walker wasn't getting some catches on him, but it wasn't like TJ Tampa wasn't knocking some passes down. Tampa was getting involved. He was making good plays. That is a healthy battle, right? One guy wins some, another guy wins some. It goes back and forth, and then both guys come out winners or risers or whatever you want to say. Tampa's a player that I think might have a bigger role than some people might anticipate this season, especially if this Marlon Humphrey thing, I don't know what the deal is. We're going to probably find out more this week. But whatever the deal is there, we're going to figure it out. But if Marlon, if there's another injury this year, and that's not just about Marlon, if it's Brandon Stevens or Nate Wiggins, and again, knock on wood, there's a knock. Hopefully that does not happen. But they're going to need their corner depth to step up in a big way. Now, speaking of their corners, the first one they took in Mr. Nate Wiggins has also adapted pretty well to the NFL game. He's being able to not only just cover effectively, but also he was able to identify certain zones. He was in the zone of Mark Andrews on one play, and Andrews was not able to come with a pass. And him and Roquan Smith actually on a play were assigned in tandem. So for me, it feels like he's a guy that is learning the NFL game, right? It wasn't like he was targeted a ton. We're hearing in these articles that, it's not like he's getting targeted a lot. But there's a lot of things to like about Nate Wiggins, particularly showing off his speed in these OTA drills. A couple of undrafted guys also making a name for themselves. You got Jordan Tolles and you got Trace Swilling, which are good. But then some of the other guys, you got Pepe Williams and Jalen Davis making a name for themselves too, which, look, if the Ravens can get production, even just from one of those guys, that would be incredible. You got Pepe Williams having an interception, and you have Jalen Davis making some plays as well. I mean, these guys are key for Baltimore. It's not like they're going to be the number one, number two corners for the Ravens this season, but corner depth is so valuable. And at this point, if we were to start the season today, I don't know that either one of those guys makes the roster. Maybe Pepe Williams does as a backup slot guy, which leads me into feels like Darius Washington is getting a lot of hype as the third safety for this team, at least initially. Sanusi Kane also was a guy that is a rookie, has had a couple of big plays early, which for the Ravens safety depth, considering they lost, Daryl Worley's not signed yet, but obviously the big one was Geno Stone. It's going to be big for the Ravens to get production if they decide to go outside the organization or if they want to stay inside of it. You got to have guys step up like Geno Stone did last season, especially if there's an injury. And it seems like Darius Washington, Sanusi Kane, they're making a name for themselves. So good news on the Ravens secondary depth making a name and figuring out this is a big year for that. So I'm excited for that. But coming up in the second part of the show, we'll talk about a couple of fallers for the Ravens during OTAs, what that means for them, their positional groups, and a lot more. Stay tuned, plenty to talk about here on Locked On Ravens. First of the show is brought to you by FanDuel. And summertime means baseball, the NBA Finals, and more. And you can bet it all over on FanDuel. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets. Any winning $5 bet. That's $200 you can bet on everything from Finals MVP to who's going to hit one out of the park. So obviously in Baltimore land here, you got Gunnar Henderson potentially, right, leading. You got MVP votes all over the place, and I know there are a lot of guys who are worthy of that award, Juan Soto, Aaron Judge, etc., but Gunnar Henderson firmly in there, so if you want to bet Gunnar Henderson odds, head over to FanDuel, and then you want to talk about the Ravens a little bit. Again, over on FanDuel, you can open up the Ravens betting with Ravens Chiefs. Ravens opened up that game, 2.5-point underdog, so if you want to go over there on FanDuel and bet that, you have it over there. And, of course, that line will probably be changing plenty before that game starts. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and a big win to your summer bucket list. FanDuel, America's number one sportsbook. We're back for our second segment of Locked On Ravens. Kevin Oestreicher still talking with you here on this Monday. Again, really appreciate everybody being here, making us a part of your day on Locked On Ravens. And be sure to make Locked On Sports Today a part of your day as well, as Peter Bukowski has all of the latest updates on the biggest news in all of sports. So every single sport, Peter has it covered. He does a great job over on the Locked On Podcast Network here, your team every day. Really appreciate everybody, again, on this show who's been an everydayer. If you've been rocking with me forever here on Locked On Ravens and you listen every day, means the world to me. If you're new to the channel, welcome in. Be sure to subscribe, follow along. We're actually, at the time of this recording, I think we're under 30 subscribers away from 7,000, which is, again, another huge milestone for me and for this channel. And it's been a long journey. I've been the host of the show for almost 5 years now, so appreciate everybody who is new. And also, if you're somewhere in the middle, welcome back into the channel. Now, in terms of fallers during Ravens OTAs, again, the good news is that there are not a ton of fallers compared to the risers. I think we saw a lot more, and you can't really take so much away, again, from guys not being in pads, but reps are reps, and that's really important, where even though we're not going to really know a ton until the pads come on, you can still take away bits and pieces here and there. Now, I mentioned there's an offensive lineman whose name is on this list, and that is Daniel Faalele, and apparently, according to everybody there, things were pretty good for Daniel Faalele starting off, but on the last week, it was Daniel Faalele struggling in practice. He appeared to be tired and gassed, and just, whether that's, him physically not being there or whatnot, seemed like he was bent over in the huddle, kneeling a lot on the sideline, and Kyle Barber here detailing that he was heavily fatigued, and because of that, his play struggled and suffered, and a trainer eventually ended up pulling him over to the sideline on some of these reps. So not a great end to OTAs for Daniel Faalele here. And again, I don't want to just take away, Faalele's cooked and he's not going to contribute. Not in that. I don't want to do that, because OTAs, much like the risers thing, right? Just because someone performs well at OTAs doesn't mean that, they're going to break out and they're winning the starting job and this, that, and the other. it's both sides here, where we can obviously acknowledge that the good play or the bad play happened, but we're not going to pull everything and make one huge assumption based off of it. So again, even though it wasn't a great end to OTAs for Daniel Falele, I still think there's an opportunity for him. Obviously, mandatory minicamp will tell a different story. Training camp will tell another story. So it's like, what does the overall story look like? We are only in the beginning part of this. And maybe with the way the NFL offseason is potentially going to change, there's something that ends up happening in OTAs and minicamp and all don't even exist anymore. But at the end of the day, the Ravens drafted Roger Rosengarten. I'm still expecting him to win that right tackle job, but as important depth, important even swing tackle depth for Baltimore, Daniel Falele could play a role for them depending on, one, how training camp goes. I'm not crowning Roger Rosengarten, but with 3 new offensive linemen, 3 starters gone, that's going to be a big test. And we've seen crazier things happen before, even on that offensive line, where we thought Tyree Phillips back in 2021, or maybe it was, I can't remember, it was either 2020 or 2021, but one of those 2 years, we thought, oh, Tyree Phillips is going to win that starting job, and he's a young guy, he earned it. And then they started DJ Fluker as the vet. So maybe they want to go Falele instead of Rosengarten. I would think that would not happen. That'd be a pretty big shock to me, in my opinion. But again, not a great end to OTAs for Daniel Falele. Now, I also want to do a couple of injury ones as well. This, again, has nothing to do with their play on the field because they just were not on it. But Adisa Isaac, I think, is a faller for me. I don't know what the role Adisa Isaac is going to play is going to be this year, but I'm not expecting it to be super huge, especially considering he did miss some time here. Now, it doesn't seem super serious. Seems like these guys are going to be back at some point, whether it be during minicamp or training camp. But with Adisa Isaac, he was the hamstring issue, I believe, and then you have Bo Braid with the ankle. Both of those guys are fallers, in my opinion, just because they weren't able to get the reps in and be able to make a name for themselves, where injuries at this point, any point, it's work you're missing out on. And we talk about that with Lamar and all that, and the vets that are not showing up, but it's a little different when you're talking about the vets versus the rookies or vets versus the young guys. Most of these workouts are for the young guys, right? Where obviously it's important for vets to be there, get the work in, and work with your teammates, work with your coaching staff. I'm not trying to downplay the importance of it, but I think it is more important for the rookies and the younger guys than it is for the vets. So the fact those two weren't on the field. Now, also the Marlon situation to me is very interesting. I wasn't really thinking about it until the comments were made by John Harbaugh. At some point, apparently, he should be back. Again, minicamp, whether that's full go or not, or what it may be, there's no guarantee he's a full go at minicamp. I don't know the situation with Marlon. Again, I am hoping, and we are all, I think, hoping to learn more over the next week or two about what that means. And again, in terms of like what mandatory minicamp means, we'll talk about that in the final part of the show. But Marlon, whether it's injury, and again, I'd assume this is, but his injuries last season were not easy for him. And it came down to him playing in the championship game and coming back, and him and Mark Andrews both were not fully healthy. I would have thought to this point that he would be fully healthy for workouts, but we're going to see. John Harbaugh did make those comments. He was asked about him, and that's just how it went. But at the end of the day, we're going to end up seeing what happened with Marlon Humphrey, or what has been going on, I guess, with Marlon Humphrey at this point. Now, for David Ojabo, he's another guy that a lot of people are looking out for when he's going to be back, when's he going to be back. Now, it feels like for him, training camp will be the drill deadline for him in terms of when he's going to get back on the field fully for drills. Going to be probably training camp. But again, it's just not the start that you would want. You want to have all your guys on the field, want to have everybody not injured and healthy. We had talked a couple of weeks ago, honestly, probably even a month ago at this point, about, what does the injury situation look like for the Ravens? They're already in trouble with some of these rookie injuries. And again, that'd be a pretty big overreaction to call them in trouble because we're still a couple months away from the season starting. But you don't want to see guys injured right now. You don't want to see guys missing time right now. So it's different when you talk about minicamp versus OTAs, because obviously minicamp is mandatory. Voluntary OTAs are voluntary. So that's what we get to in the final part of the show a little bit, what to expect from mandatory minicamp and all the conversation surrounding it. So we should have stay tuned, plenty to talk about here on the show. First, the show is brought to you by DK Law Group. When you need a law firm, do you want the legal runaround, or would you rather have a no-nonsense approach? Well, you get the latter with DK Law Group. DK Law Group is a Maryland-based law firm who is redefining the legal process with their modern approach. DK Law Group specializes in real estate law, estate planning, business law, and family law. They're tech-savvy. They treat clients like family, and they focus on keeping your legal solutions simple. DK Law Group is a woman-led firm with Diana Khan at the helm. Diana has been called an unparalleled legal expert by some. One of the things you'll quickly notice with DK Law Group is their transparent pricing. They believe in clarity and cost and no one left in limbo. DK Law Group knows that speed is key. By leveraging technology, DK Law Group streamlines the process to serve you better and faster. Contact DK Law Group today at dklawmd.com. Locked On listeners can call today to schedule a free 30-minute consultation when you mention the tagline Empowering Legacies. We're back, our final segment of Locked On Ravens. Kevin Ostreicher still here with you on Monday. I didn't go anywhere here, and neither should you here on Locked On Ravens. We are 5 days per week, Monday through Friday. So even in these quote-unquote lull periods of the offseason, this right now really isn't, because we got Ravens workouts coming up with minicamp. But after minicamp, obviously there'll be a bit of a downturn. Players are off until training camp starts. Well, off. They're still going to be working, but even then, we're going to be 5 days a week. So be sure to subscribe, follow along, video form and audio form here. If you want to listen one day in audio form, watch another day in video form, we have you covered. It's the same show, both audio and video. Let's talk about minicamp a little bit. I think it's a little, each step in the process of getting to the season, it's a little more and then a little more and then a little. So obviously, as I mentioned in the second segment, what's the main difference? Well, minicamp is mandatory. OTAs are voluntary. So that's the main difference here. Where if you don't show up to minicamp, there's an issue. Like voluntary OTAs with the veterans is like, okay, look, it's not required. So I'm not going to rag on anybody who's not there. Obviously, again, my stance, I would prefer everybody to be there. Like for Lamar, I would prefer for him to be there all the time. But since it's voluntary, I'm not going to rag on him for it because it's his decision, right? That's his thing. So with minicamp, it's different. Now, the Ravens don't have any contract disputes or anything crazy going on with all that, right? Like, there should be no one who is not showing up. Now, in terms of who's practicing, that's a little different in terms of, well, the injury situations we just talked about in the second part of the show and kind of what ends up happening with that when guys get back on the field. But that doesn't mean they should not be at the facility. Obviously, we have been through this with Lamar Jackson in terms of contract disputes. Even remember last year, Rashad Bateman and his whole thing, like he didn't show up for a couple of days, actually ended up costing him his fifth-year option. But then you have guys like J.K. Dobbins who had the hold in, and that was, training camp, minicamp, whatever you want to say. Like, the Ravens don't have any of that this season. Like, I would be genuinely shocked and floored if there was something like that this year. We haven't had any indication that's a thing. Nothing of that sort seems to be going on. Now, for other teams, like Justin Jefferson just signed his extension, but the big storyline in Cincinnati, if you want to keep an eye out on a division rival right now for the Ravens, is Jamar Chase and T. Higgins. Are those guys going to show up to mandatory minicamp? Then you start getting a little dicey, and we already know that things aren't necessarily rosy right now when it comes to the Jamar Chase and T. Higgins contract situations, and the Justin Jefferson extension certainly doesn't help that. The Ravens don't have anything like that. And I think everybody can focus. I think the Lamar Jackson thing, the team, Lamar, everybody was trying to make it not a distraction. I think it was to an extent. Now, how much of an extent? I think there are varying opinions on that. But, look, it was all that anybody talked about for a while. And I know the Ravens had that. Even if you want to talk about, like, the hard deadline they had to negotiate, and then they said, okay, we're done when the season starts, it was still a distraction that whole season, even though the team, and Lamar and everybody didn't want it to be, it was still one. Those distractions can have an impact. So I'm just excited for, and again, I knock on wood, this actually is the case, but a calm minicamp for the Ravens in terms of that stuff. No contract disputes, no crazy things going on, just football. That's all we want, just football. Make it about football. Make it about getting better, focusing on your goal. And again, the Ravens aren't going to win or lose the Super Bowl based off of how mandatory minicamp goes. They weren't going to win or lose it based off of who showed up to OTAs, right? But this stuff is important in terms of just getting a head start, and especially with these younger guys taking on leadership roles. On Saturday's bonus episode of the show, which we did a couple of days ago, we talked about how important it is for the leaders on this team. But I'm not just talking about, Lamar Jackson, Roquan Smith, all those guys. I'm talking about these younger leaders, Zay Flowers, Rashad Bateman, Kyle Hamilton, like these players getting in, Tyler Linderbaum, right? Getting in these reps of being able to work with these younger players and understand what it's like to be a leader in a bigger role. So minicamp gives you another opportunity for that. It's a way to set a tone and get good momentum going into that last month, or that, I guess, the last month of rest for the Ravens before a really long and very demanding grind that the Ravens have to start up in July for training camp. Again, leads into the preseason, leads into the regular season, will hopefully lead to a long playoff and Super Bowl run for this team. And I think Baltimore's locked in on that goal. They're locked in on the fact that they lost to Kansas City in heartbreaking, embarrassing, whatever you want to call it, fashion. And they're ready to right those wrongs. And I think we're going to see a lot of that, emotion come out during these workouts. Now, when is it really going to come out? It's going to come out during the season, right? Just like OTAs, there's only so much you can take away from minicamp. There's not like this whole like, we're watching everybody be great right now. That means they're going to be great during the regular season. Minicamp is still a no-pad situation. It's still lighter compared to a lot of these training camp. In fact, all training camp practices. We talked with Qadri Ismail, former Ravens receiver, former NFL player, who said that, yeah, you know what? Training camp intensity is different. It's all these workouts is different levels of intensity for this team and for what ends up going on. So I'm not necessarily super, good reps mean this guy is great and bad reps mean this guy is bad. Much like OTAs, it's just a little bit more of a ramp-up process than OTAs. And then from there, training camp is really that ramp-up process. Then you're moving into a speedy track of getting to the regular season once you hit training camp. But we're almost there. Just about a month away, a little over a month away till training camp starts. And then from there, we'll get to preseason, regular season, and it'll be a breeze. So hopefully minicamp gives the Ravens some more answers, but it will not give them nearly all the answers. Of course, we will find that out over the coming months. That's all I have to hear today, though, on Locked on Ravens. Thank you so much for tuning in. Come up tomorrow, more Ravens content, so be sure to stay tuned. I'll see you right back here tomorrow on Locked on Ravens.